thanks for being here. I'm with Joe Herring, who is the Chief Executive of Covance, one of our sponsors at the Forbes Healthcare Summit, and also head of one of the largest clinical research organizations in the world. So, Joe, explain what a CRO is. I think a lot of people don't realize what you guys do.
Well, the CRO industry conducts safety and efficacy testing on behalf of sponsors. It generates the data submitted to the FDA to get their new medicines approved. Mm-hmm. Most people think that that's all done inside of a pharmaceutical or biotechnology company.
Once it was.
Yes, and it was. And now roughly 50% is done by contract research organizations like Covance.
And so that's from the beginning of preclinical early chemical work all the way through the last
phase 1, 2, 3, and
trials.
even post-marketing surveillance, yes.
Yeah. So what's the advantage to doing it as part of a CRO as opposed to companies doing it themselves or using academics, which is kind of the other way a lot of these studies get done? What do you bring to the table that's different?
Well, historically, in the go-go days of the pharmaceutical industry, they were vertically integrated, did literally everything in-house. And the, I think, unintended consequence of that is you build a big fixed cost infrastructure. Mm-hmm. And on the backside of patent expirations and slower or no revenue growth, then that fixed cost infrastructure becomes a problem. So the CRO model was built to be less expensive, faster, and to bring breadth and depth to the drug development process. So as an example, let's say a company had a very large franchise in oncology and lost a patent, and they in-license or develop something in neuroscience. Are they going to build this big fixed cost infrastructure of doctors, PhDs, and global reach, or are they going to buy it from a variable source like a CRO? And by the way, while you weren't looking, the larger CROs are bigger than even the largest pharmaceutical companies in terms of the R&D footprint.
And by terms, you don't mean in terms of obviously revenue, but in terms of number of...
In terms of numbers of employees, the numbers of countries where they're conducting research, larger than pharma companies.
Now, aren't there downsides, though, to to dealing with that footprint? I mean, we've seen a bunch of trials. One of them was the first Medivation Alzheimer's drug comes to mind. One of Eli Lilly's schizophrenia drugs, where trials in other parts of the world where they were cheaper to conduct didn't actually line up with what happened in phase 3. And a lot of people blamed the sites, and be it Eastern Europe, or I think in both those cases it was Russia. I mean, isn't there a downside to this globalization? I mean, I know I've heard that from some of the academics who do trials, that they're afraid the data is dirtier.
Sure. Well, first of all, keep in mind that it's more and more difficult to enroll patients in clinical trials in the US and Western Europe. Think about the typical American. They're on many different drugs, which make them a poor research subject. To even get trials completed required going to more emerging markets. And I know that there are specific examples like the one you cited, but there's also a global study done by ACRO, our trade association, and we looked at the data collected by the top 10 CROs in the world and found that Latin America, Eastern Europe, Asia, the data quality was as good or better than that collected in Western countries. And in many of those countries, there are Western-trained physicians who wanted to go home and bring modern medicine to patients in those geographies. Mm-hmm. And frankly, they do outstanding work.
And so, how much can you speed up the recruitment of clinical trials? How fast can they get? I mean, what can you do that a pharma couldn't do?
Well, there's data from Tufts University that shows that work done by a CRO is approximately 30% faster than what's done by sponsor organizations. There's a very large study done a couple of years ago. But keep in mind that this is our core business. This is all we do. Mm-hmm. So we wake up every day thinking about how can we apply technology, how can we apply talent, global reach, and process efficiency to speed drug development. And there's a recent independent survey done just in the last month or so where 50% of all people inside of pharma R&D thought that CRO work was more efficient than work that's done in-house.
Mm-hmm. And so, aside from efficiency, another argument about CROs that I've heard, and this was actually a quote from Bob Harrington, now at Stanford. It was back when he was at Duke, and it was about your illustrious competitor that was his neighbor there. quintiles. But there were some ads saying the answer is quintiles, the answer is yes, and he said the answer shouldn't always be yes. The implication being that you guys, that without academics in the process, there's no one to tell the companies no. I mean, how comfortable can a CRO be telling Pfizer, no, we don't think that's the right way to go? I mean,
well, first of all, Matt, we work with academic research organizations all the time. Think about a large cardiovascular outcome study. It's generally going to be a CRO and an ARO hooked together. So we work with them as partnership. It's not a competitive situation generally. The second thing is we collect data according to GLP, GCP, and we bring the facts and the truth to the package. That's our job. If a CRO were to ever in any way falsify data, it would be a cardinal sin and you would go out of business. So our job is to develop the data, the packages. It's pharma's obligation to report the data for the submission.
Right.
And frankly,
and when there have been problems with data from that came in from CROs, we've heard about that at FDA panels. Certainly. We've certainly seen that drama where the data comes in and it isn't clean.
But there's drama with data coming from sponsors, as well.
Right.
But now more than 50% of all employees in the world that are doing clinical research are employed by a CRO. And so at that scale, you'd be hearing about it every day if there was a quality issue.
How do the ongoing layoffs at Sanofi, Pfizer, Merck, we just heard about, how do they affect you as a business? I know there was a big example where Eli Lilly you basically took some of Eli Lilly's footprint. I mean, how does that affect you now? Fewer compounds, people to hire, what do you?
Actually, I think the facts are beginning to show that actually smaller research organizations are more efficient. If you look at the biotech industry and some of the large pharma companies who have gone through large downsizings are actually being more productive in R&D. So I don't think it's related to the numbers of people.
Well, it's often related to the numbers of products that are coming out of the lab when it's at its large size. They just can't support.
Yeah, but what's the quality of the compounds coming out in high volume versus what is the quality of the compounds?
Well, I'm saying we certainly have examples of big research lab, low volume.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. But the big change, I think, is that as this fixed cost infrastructure is really a problem for pharmaceutical companies, and as they've outsourced more and CROs have grown, many of those employees are now work for a CRO. I mean, there's one pharma company, we have almost 1,000 of their ex-employees that are working at Covance. But you cited the Lilly example. So the Greenfield campus was Lilly's single largest research facility. And when things were going great, they had almost 1,200 employees there. And through outsourcing and changes in their need to have changes in their cost structure, there were about 300 employees. And they were trying to decide whether to keep it open or not. And frankly, we needed the capacity. So we took over that facility, made it Covance, and instead of serving one pipeline, now there are 100 clients placing studies there. And the employment has more than doubled in the last 5 years.
And what's the turnover been like among the original 300, do you know?
It's minimal. I think in the first 3 years there were only 5 or 6.
Wow.
And again, we've recruited a lot more employees to the site. But Lilly's single biggest concern about that $1.6 billion 10-year deal was business continuity. And they stated that. And they've been on the record publicly saying it went faster and better than they had hoped. And we're celebrating 5 years now of that landmark agreement.
All right. One last question about dealing with the expanding size of clinical trials and data quality. One complaint I've heard, and I've heard this mostly in psychiatry, but it does seem to generalize, that as the trials have gotten bigger, and there have been more of them, there's kind of more people who are professional enrollers, not professional trialists, and that's hurt data quality, particularly in psychiatry with regards to placebo effect, but generally speaking. Is that something that we can find ways to counter? I mean, it's obviously not entirely the CRO's fault. They're also just more trials and they're bigger. Sure. But it's obviously a problem for...
Well, there are shared registries that CROs, even though we compete, we share to try to head off the professional subject, but also the notion of the global trials. You automatically sort of walk out of that environment when you're recruiting patients in more of the emerging markets.
How do we keep the cost of trials down? I mean, they've gotten more and more expensive per head, and people talk about large, simple trials, and then sometimes those are too large or too simple. How do we keep them, get the data we need, and keep the cost of trials down?
I think we're actually at a very exciting intersection between technology and science that's going to, I think, drive down the cost of drug development and actually make it better. So if you think about, the genomic sequencing and biomarkers, and ultimately we target the right drug for the right patient at the right time, and that's going to be more cost effective for all of society. And then the whole notion of electronic data capture, storing and reporting of clinical trial information. We are making big investments in mining that data to pick the right investigator sites and to do other things that make drug development more efficient. So I'm excited about the future of the industry. I do think we're going to be able to move faster, more cost effectively, and again, get the right drug for the right patient at the right time.